to follow suit or face heavy penalties.
I didn't say that was my point of view.
No.
Can you just confirm that the areas we're talking about for level playing field are just the half a dozen or so that were referenced in the political declaration a year ago, or has the scope of that expanded into other regulatory issues?
It's essentially the same area, but one of the things that is the case with the EU, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, is that you can sometimes find that regulations which were brigaded under one headline can find their way into another. So things that might have been termed employment rights can find themselves brigaded under health and safety at different points. But the broad outlines are correct.
Okay, that would sound to be a little approaching bad faith if they were to try that kind of thing, I suppose, in future. Do you think these talks have been conducted in a spirit of both sides acting in good faith, or do you think some of the movement in the EU demands has taken us beyond that?
Well, I think, and I'll dodge the question, I think a judgment can be made at the end of the process. I think there have been moments of strain and difficulty, but the negotiators are working hard at the moment, so I wouldn't want to make their job any more difficult by providing any sort of Monday morning quarterbacking.
We'll look forward to seeing you next time to ask it then. And finally, I've asked you for a percentage chance of a deal by Sunday night, which appears to be the European Parliament's deadline. You're going to give me a high percentage. Is it more or lower than your usual 66%?
I'll stick, well, my new resolution, adopted from a few weeks ago, is to avoid giving percentages. But I think at the moment, actually, as I said to Peter, I think regrettably, the chances are more likely that we won't secure an agreement. So at the moment, less than 50%.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Anthony Higginbottom.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much, Secretary of State, for coming before us. In March, you told us that we were going to put in place a robust state aid subsidy system. Could you just give us an update on where we are with that?
Yes, the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy has been working on an approach which makes sure that it respects both free market principles, but also allows us to intervene in an appropriate way. One of the issues, though, in the negotiations, which I think is relevant, and it adds to the point that Nigel made, is that one of the things the EU has been arguing is that transnational, supranational state aid should be exempt. So the EU's position is this: the UK is a nation. It must have a form of reporting and monitoring state aid which replicates that which member states have within the EU. But the EU itself, when it comes to providing funding at an EU level, should be totally exempt from those rules. So you would have a situation where, for the sake of argument, the EU at the level of the 27 could provide support, let's say, for the production of electric vehicles. But if the UK said, well, we too want to use government money to prime that new technology, then the terms which the EU want us to agree would mean that we would be prevented from doing so. And we think that that is a fundamental problem, that the Union of the United Kingdom, like the Union of the European Union, should be, of course, in a position where it respects clear rules about how state aid is provided. But at the moment, or certainly during the course of these negotiations, the EU has sought for itself freedom from restraints that it wouldn't grant us.
It sounds very much like there's a game of double standards being played there. Could I just, you'll know that the election last year, a key pillar for us was being able to intervene in key markets. You know, it's the way we will secure a competitive advantage in the future. And unlike the EU, I don't think a competitive advantage is something to be shied away from. It's, you know, exactly what we ought to be doing. So could you just reassure us that we are going to keep that flexibility? That means as we look at different industries in the future, and that, you know, I know we're looking at hydrogen and space and electric vehicles, we will retain that sovereign ability to find the markets where we as the UK will have a competitive advantage and intervene and make sure that we can boost them.
Absolutely. Well, one of the purposes of reclaiming independence and being sovereign is the capacity to be able to do different things in different ways. We won't be diverging purely for the sake of it, but you are absolutely right that there are a number of areas where the UK does have an advantage because of the skill of our people or because of the enterprise shown by innovators. And so your own constituents in Burnley are very much in the forefront of our mind when we're thinking about how we can make sure that there are high quality jobs in the sunrise industries of the future.
No, that will be pleasing news to them, Secretary of State. Just on the Secretary of State for Businesses plans, can you give us a rough timeline on when we might expect to see the legislative proposals for what the regime might look like?
Well, I can't preempt what the Leader of the House might say about the next legislative session, but there will be substantive BEIS legislation which will give effect to our position on state aid and on other ways of supporting business.
And that won't hold up the negotiations. We can proceed with the negotiations, try and get an agreement, although, you know, totally accept it. It might not be in our interest. The EU's not holding that up as a, you must lay the proposals before we're willing to discuss.
No, they want to understand the approach that we're taking broadly, and we want to understand their approach. But it is the case that measures will be brought forward by the Secretary of State for BEIS on subsidy control in the next parliamentary session.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. Keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Now to Sally Ann Hart. Sally Ann.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Mr. Gove and your colleagues. I'm going to ask about fisheries. That's probably not a surprise. And I think it's clear that the British fishing fleets do need to rebuild in order to fish all our waters that have now reverted back to the UK and our fishermen from the 31st of December 2021. So, thinking of that, on what basis is the government offering the EU access for EU fishing vessels and crews to UK waters from the 1st of January?
Well, thank you, Sally Ann. The first and most important thing to stress is that in international law, the UK will be an independent coastal state, and it's very important that that is recognised by the EU. But as you quite rightly point out, it's also the case that it will take a little bit of time for the UK fishing fleet to expand in the way that we'd want it to take advantage of the additional capacity that will be available to catch. And it's also the case that we'll want to invest in ports and harbours across the UK in order to make sure that we have the processing ability as well. So what we hope to do is to reach an approach with the EU whereby they understand that while, of course, the principle of annual negotiations is at the heart of the way that we will do things, that they can have confidence about a staged approach whereby they will have a degree of confidence and certainty over the decreasing level of availability of stocks to them and the increasing level of availability of stocks to UK fishermen.
And when you're thinking about a staged approach, do you have any year basis, whether it's 3 years, 5 years?
Well, the EU have talked about a 10-year approach, and in the particular 10-year approach that they've outlined as well, has some other aspects which will be very, very, very difficult. We are negotiating hard in order to impress upon the EU the point that we just want to be an independent coastal state like others, and that they negotiate on an annual basis with Norway, with Iceland, with the Faroes, and that we must be able to find a way which means that the UK's control over its fishing waters and the rights of its coastal communities are properly respected without an overlong timetable or undue restraint on our freedom of manoeuvre.
So if we reach no deal this year, and from the 1st of January without a deal, essentially the EU has no access to our waters, is that right?
It has no rights of access, you are absolutely right. Now, we would want to reach a pragmatic arrangement with the EU, even in those circumstances, but if there is no deal on the 31st of December, then on the 1st of January, it's the case that European ships would lose access to our waters.
So something is better than nothing. So just moving,
yes.
Is the UK asking for all the fish? Sorry, is the UK asking for all fish caught in the UK waters to be landed in the UK?
No, and you know it is the case that at the moment in the English Channel. I think it is the case that for some stocks there, only 7% of the stocks are allocated to UK fishermen, 83% in the case of one stock to French fishermen. So no, and there are well-established principles which allow European boats to fish in our waters and, of course, to land the fish in their own harbours. But what we do want to see is just a simple and straightforward move to more equitable share.
Thank you. Will the fisheries agreement you're seeking mean fundamental change on the 1st of January for those catching the fish in the UK waters and selling their fish to the EU market?
I would hope that what we would see is a move and an adjustment that reflects the UK's position as an independent coastal state, gives our fishermen more access to our own fish, but also at the same time, in an ideal world, we would want to have tariff-free access for fish and shellfish products to the EU market. That's our aim. And indeed vice versa.
Yes, and so obviously there is a hope that there will be a transition period to allow those concerned to adjust to the new trading arrangements.
Well, we certainly wanted to make sure that everyone can be comfortable with the new trading arrangements. I should say that for all fisheries exporters, irrespective of what happens in the free trade agreement, it will be the case that they will need export health certificates and catch certificates in order to sell their products in the EU market. But again, to be fair to the EU, and in particular the French, they've ensured that there should be as smooth a level of access as possible by making it clear that there will be a dedicated border control post for fisheries products, not at Calais, but in Boulogne-sur-Mer, where the principal French fish market is. So on a pragmatic business-to-business level, arrangements have been made in order to ensure that the trade can continue. But I know that fish processors have been contacted by DEFRA in order to make sure that they're aware of what their requirements will be.
And Mr. Gove, one last question on fisheries.
Very quickly, yeah.
The 6 to 12 nautical miles from the UK, can you confirm that British fishermen will have the sole rights to fish in there as from the 1st of January?
Yes, that is our intention.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sally Ann. I now turn to Nicola Richards. Nicola.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, Secretary of State. How do you think the UK Internal Market Bill has influenced the negotiations so far?
Well, I think that it's difficult to make a definitive judgment, but I do think, speaking personally, that the UK Internal Markets Bill has done three good things. The first thing is that it's given businesses certainty within the UK that the non-discrimination and market access principles will be observed. The second thing is that it's demonstrated that as EU structural funding disappears, that the UK will be able, through the broad shoulders of the Treasury, to support every part of the United Kingdom to grow. But in the third respect, I think it's also demonstrated that the UK Parliament will always assert its sovereign right to do what is right for the people of the United Kingdom. And if we can reach agreement with our partners so that we no longer need to act in a particular way, so much the better. But I do believe that even though it caused something of a stramash at the time, that the UK Internal Market Bill certainly helped to concentrate minds when it came to making sure that the Northern Ireland Protocol was concluded satisfactorily.
Thank you. Would you say that the benefits then outweighed any costs?
Yes.
And have both sides accepted the non-regression principles for social and environmental standards?
Yes, I think that was never really an issue from the beginning. Again, we have proudly higher standards in the UK, certainly on the environment and climate change, and in a number of social workplace rights that are required through membership of the EU. The issue is not will we maintain high standards, it's whether or not the EU has the right to demand that we follow suit or face penalties if they change their rules.
So would there be any implications to agreeing to all of the non-regression principles in full?
No, in principle, non-regression is right, and it's a feature of free trade agreements like the one that Canada has with the European Union, which we're seeking not to replicate entirely, but which is broadly the approach that we think is right. Indeed, the approach which originally Michel Barnier suggested would be a good option for the UK.
And how similar will the dispute resolution be when compared to the withdrawal agreement?
Well, again, this is part of the heart of the issue. We want to make sure that we have a robust and fair dispute resolution mechanism, and that it goes to the heart of some of the governance questions which have bedeviled the negotiators in the course of the last month.
Thank you, Chair. That's all my questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Nicola. And I now turn to Jane Stevenson. Jane.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon to our witnesses. I'd like to turn, if we do get a deal, I'd like to talk about how we're going to implement it by the end of the year. What legislation will be necessary to avoid a break at the end of this year, and when will the government seek to introduce this?
There will be a future relationship bill, which will be introduced as soon as we possibly can after the conclusion of any agreement. The chair of the committee pointed out earlier that a great deal of the agreement, provided the critical elements that I've mentioned are resolved, a great deal of the agreement has already been, as it were, prepared on the basis that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, but we can do legal work on the text of that. So we should be able to move relatively quickly with legislation. And then a lot depends, obviously, on the willingness of the House of Commons and the House of Lords to expedite its passage. But it should be the case that the principles behind the bill will be relatively clear and straightforward. We'll do our best, of course, to make sure that parliamentarians have ample opportunity to study the text of the agreement.
It's now the 17th, so obviously we're getting fairly close. I'd like to ask, the European Parliament has said it may make plans to sit between Christmas and the New Year in order to allow proper parliamentary scrutiny of any arrangement. Have you got provision to achieve that, or even for the first time since 1656 to call Parliament in on Christmas Day?
I think it is the case that the Leader of the House has said that Christmas Day will be sacrosanct, but I think that it's entirely possible that we could be sitting on other days. I wouldn't necessarily say every other day, but any other day right up until December the 31st. Thank
you. If we don't manage to get a deal ratified by then, and if the EU Parliament doesn't manage to ratify, what will happen then, and how do we mitigate those few days if there's a break?
Well, in the case of the European Parliament, and again, I don't want to speak definitively for them, but in the case of the European Union overall, they have a principle of provisional application, which means that they adopt the treaty and then parliaments and others can take appropriate decisions afterwards to give effect to it. But what I hope we will be able to do is to ensure that there is appropriate time to legislate. If there isn't appropriate time to legislate, then of course we will be leaving. And in fact, if we don't get a deal, and therefore there isn't appropriate time to legislate, then we'll be leaving on Australian terms.
So we don't have that same provisional application system in the UK?
We need to be able to legislate, and I think it's vitally important that Parliament does. And the time for legislation may be constrained, but I think it's vitally important that Parliament has a say on the arrangements that we reach, if we are fortunate enough to be able to reach arrangements.
If the worst happens, there is that gap, what reassurance can you offer for trade and for security cooperation until we manage to get that legislation through? Is there no interim policy there?
Our approach is that we will need to know if we have secured an agreement in time to allow Parliament to have its voice and its say and to legislate. And if we don't have time for that, then the clock has run out, and no agreement will have been reached, and we will be in a world where we'll be trading on WTO terms.
Thank you. Is there any possibility that there are areas of the provisional sort of things that have been agreed that would need to be approved by different parliaments within the European Union? And can you see any issues with their ratification process as a general, a full agreement, or would it be a mixed agreement?
It's always possible that there can be potential issues, but I think it will be a full agreement that the European Council will agree, and obviously all the member states will be represented in the Council. That is my hope.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Jane. And now turn to Seema Malhotra. Seema.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Gove, and to all who are giving evidence as well. So I just want to make one brief point, which is that, Mr. Gove, you said that the majority of businesses would prefer an FTA. I won't ask you to comment on this, but I do think that you'll know that is probably an understatement in terms of what the mood is with business and the urgency for getting clarity about how we move forward. I want to ask a very specific question, though, which you may have covered slightly elsewhere, but is it possible that there would be a temporary situation between the end of transition and either a deal being approved or perhaps entering into force? If there is that gap, what do you plan to happen?
We don't intend there to be a gap.
You may not intend, but if there is one, what would you plan to happen? How would you expect that gap to be bridged?
We will make sure that we have an agreement and that Parliament can vote on it. Or if there's not time for that, then we must accept that there won't be an agreement. And we are, as I've explained to this committee before, prepared for those consequences. And as I pointed out to Peter, we are ready to take advantage also of the opportunities that life at the end of the transition period will provide.
Thank you, Mr. Gove. I would like to just ask for clarity as well. When you say Parliament will have its voice and its say, how long do you envisage Parliament to have its voice and its say for in this process?
On a personal level, I think I'd like the maximum amount of debate, but ultimately it will be for Parliament itself through the usual channels and through the Speaker and others to decide for how long it sits once an agreement has been reached. But in my view, even though, I don't mean this frivolously, even though it's obviously inconvenient for members of Parliament, I'm sure all of us, certainly all members of this committee, would want to have as much time as possible, consistent with the rules of the House and respect for its staff, as much time as possible to look at the legislation and to review the deal that's been agreed.
I am grateful for that, because I do think that is correct, that parliamentarians would want as much time as possible. But if I could come back to your comment as well, that you give a chance of a deal at this point, a less than 50%
yes.
likelihood. In the event of no deal or a period without a deal in force, will the government reciprocate the EU's proposed contingency measures on aviation, road transport and fisheries?
We're looking very closely at those. We regard them as a step forward. I don't want to preempt decisions that might be made either by the Secretary of State for Transport or by the Environment Secretary, but I think you can legitimately conclude from this committee that we take a very positive view of reciprocating those positions, but a final decision must rest with those other members of the government.
So individual departments may make individual decisions. That's interesting. And what's your understanding of the EU's contingency measures? Are they able to be reciprocated individually, or would there be expectation that they would be as a package?
Well, I think it's important to say that in particular, when it comes to aviation and road transport, we too take a more positive and benign view. Fisheries, certainly the position as articulated by the EU is a cause of greater contention, but we'll approach these in a pragmatic way.
Just finally, Mr. Gove, will the government be offering any potential measures of its own with a view to the EU reciprocating if such a situation arises?
Well, one of the things that we have done is that we've said, for example, that we're going to stagger import controls and indeed SPS checks for the first 6 months. The EU have not said that they would do that. We respect the fact that they're a sovereign equal, and that is their choice. I think it might be the case, if we do get to a situation where we are moving to WTO terms, that there may be other announcements from the EU. But again, the EU has been clear that its approach on aviation and road haulage and fisheries is their unilateral position, and they're inviting us to reciprocate. And I respect the fact that that is a sovereign decision for the EU. But of course, in the event of WTO terms, if they make other sovereign decisions that help us and help our businesses, then we will be constructive and pragmatic in response.
Thank you, Mr. Gove. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Seema. Now turning to Joanna Cherry. Joanna.
Good afternoon, Mr. Gove. I want to ask you about the absence of a data adequacy decision from the European Union. I think I'm correct in saying that as of the 7th of December, the United Kingdom has agreed to observe existing regulations, including GDPR, but as yet the European Union's not reciprocated with an adequacy agreement. And of course, the European Court of Justice have previously voiced some concerns about the UK's handling of personal data. And there is a considerable suspicion of our Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act on the continent, where some people see it as akin to the overreach of United States surveillance powers. So really the position is this, isn't it? Although the UK is already aligned with data protection law, there's no guarantee that the crucial data adequacy agreement will be granted.
No, it's the EU's own decision. It's what's called an autonomous process. So technically and properly, it should be seen as distinct from negotiations over the FTA. And we haven't received that adequacy assurance. I'd say three things very quickly. Firstly, as you quite rightly point out, we're fully compliant at the moment. It should be straightforward. It hasn't proven to be so. The second thing that I would say is that we take data protection as a government very seriously. And the final thing that I would say is that I don't want to, what's the word, jinx proceedings, but I'm confident that there will be a way of ensuring that adequacy can be agreed.
But if there, in the absence of a data adequacy agreement, that would have pretty major implications for business in the UK and for law enforcement, wouldn't it?
Well, I think there are two important things to distinguish there, which you quite rightly do. When it comes to security, I'm confident that we can have robust arrangements in place. When it comes to business, then of course it's the case that business through the use of standard contractual clauses can provide itself with the legal assurances that it needs in order to be able to exchange data safely.
I just wonder about your confidence about robust security arrangements in the absence of a data adequacy agreement, because this morning the Home Affairs Select Committee heard evidence from expert witnesses in law enforcement that in the absence of a data adequacy agreement, any contingencies we fall back on are likely to be slower and more bureaucratic. Now that would tend to suggest that they are not as robust as you seem to hope, isn't that right?
Well, it's certainly the case that a number of people have scrutinised the range of security, law enforcement and justice tools which membership of the EU provides, and raised a number of questions, but we're working through all of those questions in order to make sure that the UK is secure. And of course, there are other steps that the UK can take outside the European Union to improve security at our borders as well.
Indeed, but I wonder if we can look at one particular example that the National Audit Office highlighted last week, when they said, they reported that the Home Office is planning to remove all SIS2 data from the warnings index, semaphore and border crossing systems on the 31st of December. And this morning at the Home Affairs Select Committee, the Director General of Operations at the National Crime Agency confirmed that that is the case. Now, that means that we will be removing from our border systems the details of more than 40,000 criminals and suspects who are wanted abroad. I mean, that's a pretty serious state of affairs, isn't it?
Well, the Schengen Information System is the one system which would absolutely, if we were to continue to have the same level of membership of, require CJEU jurisdiction. But there are alternative ways in which we can make sure that we maintain border security and indeed augment it.
But you see, the alternative ways aren't as good as Schengen too, aren't they? Are they not? Because we heard, for example, this morning at the Home Affairs Select Committee that these 40,000 names of criminals and suspects that will be removed on the 31st of December, the UK have asked our EU counterparts to upload these to the Interpol database, but we don't yet know how many of those 40,000 have been uploaded. That's right, isn't it? So it isn't fair, it isn't accurate to say that fallbacks such as Interpol will replicate Schengen 2. They're actually less robust, aren't they?
I think good people can differ on that, but I think one of the things that I would say is when it comes to security cooperation, and I say this in no boastful or jingoistic spirit, it is the case that European nations gain just as much from the excellent work of our agencies and our law enforcement agencies as we gain from them. So broad cooperation.
That's a very interesting general statement, but I'm interested to hear more in specifics, Mr. Gove. Yes. And this morning, when this issue was being discussed at Home Affairs, their select committee, evidence was heard from Deputy Assistant Commissioner Richard Martin, who's the lead for Brexit at the National Police Chiefs Council. And he said that Interpol is not as satisfactory or as robust, to use your word, a system, because with SIS2, if you come across a hit on the system, there's a legal mandate on the state to act on that hit. But with Interpol, it's a voluntary requirement, so the standard is lower. Now, he's the expert, he's right, isn't he?
Very brief answer, Mr. Gove, if you don't mind.
Yes and no.
Right, you might, well, you might like to clarify that by dropping a line to the committee, actually. But anyway, thank you very much, Joanna. Stephen Kinnock. We can't hear you, Stephen.
I'm ready to play.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I unmuted myself there then. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Mr. Gove, and thanks also to our colleagues. The government's own reasonable worst case scenario, which was published back in September, said that 40 to 70% of trucks travelling to the EU would not be ready for new border controls, and that this would lead to queues of up to 7,000 port-bound trucks in Kent and associated delays of up to 2 days. Is that still the government's reasonable worst case scenario? So we're going to have 7,000 trucks laid up in Kent for delays of up to 2 days. Has anything changed since September to change that reasonable worst case scenario?
Things have changed since September to make it more confident that that won't be the case, but a reasonable worst case scenario is always there to help with planning. And the whole point about it is that it's certainly within the bounds of possibility. It's certainly therefore something which a prudent government would take into account when planning. That's why we've acquired the infrastructure that we have. But without, again, wanting to jinx the future, we're a little bit more optimistic than we were 2 or 3 months ago about the likelihood of avoiding the reasonable worst case scenario.
So let's assume then 7,000 trucks in Kent and delays of up to 2 days. What sort of message do you think that sends to businesses in other countries that are potentially thinking of investing in the UK, that our television screens are going to be filled with queues of trucks laid up in lorry parks for 2 days?
Well, it is the case that we've seen disruption to traffic in Kent before, sometimes as a result of industrial action, sometimes as a result of other events. I think that business people will be well used to the idea that when you have a new state of affairs, there are always a couple of days or a couple of weeks before we reach the new normal. And I think that the fundamental decisions that people will make on investment in the UK will depend on the regulatory, the taxation framework, investment in infrastructure and investment in skills. My judgment is that business people, while of course conscious of news and political events, make their judgments on investment on the basis of sound long-term trends.
Thanks very much. And just to clarify there, you think this issue with the 7,000 trucks and the 1 or 2 days, that will only last for a few days in January, or is it going to go into well into 2021? Are we looking for this scenario to be alleviated by the summer? How long will this be going on for?
Well, again, and it's an understandable take on things, it is not a prediction. We plan for the worst so that we can be ready to deal with it, but the projections in a reasonable worst case scenario are not the main case. They're not the base case which we expect to happen. Again, it's very, very difficult to make accurate predictions, as we know, when there are so many variables, but I think I've said in another forum that I would expect that we would find that after an initial few days and weeks of potential disruption, that things will resolve themselves into a new normal relatively early in the new year. Because again, the risk of the disruption that you quite rightly draw attention to flows from businesses, traders and hauliers not having the necessary documentation. And we and members of this committee have played a part in this, have sought to make sure that traders are ready so that the risk of disruption is reduced.
With permission, may I just add also to say, of course, that for those traders who are not ready on the 1st of January, there will, of course, be much support from government helplines, webinars. We'll continue running those to make sure that those traders can get ready as quickly as possible so that before they attempt to send goods across the channel, they are ready. Because, of course, it is the level of trader readiness which ultimately determines whether and for how long disruption might continue. If I may say one other thing, I think the committee will know that we've introduced a web service called Check an HGV is ready to cross the border. This is mandatory for hauliers who are taking goods across the short straits to use. What they do is they use the service to certify that the correct documentation is in place, and that issues with them with a Kent access permit. We had committed to sending that service live this Monday. We did that. It is operational, it is working, and indeed haulage firms are already using it to get their Kent access permits. And what we hope that will do is make sure that a lot higher percentage of trucks that arrive at the ports in Kent are ready and can make therefore a successful crossing, thereby avoiding that disruption.
Thanks very much. I'd like to change by quite some degree now to talk about Erasmus.
It'll have to be the final question, sorry, Stephen. So
thank you very much. Yeah, I was quite surprised to hear you say, Mr. Gove, at the start that in response to the chair, that Erasmus is covered under these negotiations. You gave the clear impression that it's all sorted and therefore we would be able to continue to participate in a programme that I think most people feel adds a tremendous amount of value and benefit, both in terms of British students going out and learning new skills and languages, and also EU students coming here and getting a great impression of our university system and of our society, and it really enhances our soft power. So I think most people feel that it's a good thing, and yet Michel Barnier made it absolutely clear to MEPs on Monday that the United Kingdom will be ejected from the Erasmus programme. Can you just confirm that that is the case, that we will not be participating in Erasmus?
Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, and we are considering which EU programmes we should be part of in the future. And again, I think when we're looking at both Erasmus and Horizon, there are different judgments about their value to the UK, but we're looking at those in the round as part of the discussions.
Okay.
Why then do you?
No, I'm sorry.
Sorry, Chair.
I do apologise, Stephen, but we've almost run out of time. Just a couple of final things from me, Mr. Gove. The government talks often, in the event of no deal, on the UK leaving the transitional period on Australian terms. can you just confirm that Australia does not have a trade agreement with the European Union, does it?
It trades under WTO rules.
It trades under WTO rules. Fine. It does have, however, a mutual recognition on conformity assessments, certification and markings with the EU. If we're leaving on Australian terms, are you saying that you think the EU would give us the same mutual recognition on those issues as it gives Australia?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the EU has already made some unilateral decisions in anticipation of our leaving on Australian terms. I can't accurately predict which other consideration it would give, but the point about an Australian-style exit is that it's not symmetrical with the relationship Australia enjoys. It is very, very similar. When we talk about a Canada-style deal, it's not exactly the same as CETA. It's very, very similar. And one of the things that I would say is that, for example, the provisions that the Commissioner talked about on aviation and on road haulage are provisions that, for understandable reasons, don't extend to Australia. So they're not entirely coterminous, but they are very similar. They're twins, but not identical twins.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, you've made it very clear why the EU's original proposals in relation to the level playing field were not acceptable, because the EU side could decide that the level playing field had become unlevel, so to speak, and therefore could impose tariffs or countervailing measures. But can you just clarify, since the key issue is who decides whether unfair competition has resulted from any divergence, that is the question, would the government be prepared to accept an independent arbitration mechanism determining whether in fact the level playing field had been tilted one way or the other?
That is potentially possible, but a huge amount depends on what the arbitration panel is being asked to decide. Again, by their very nature, judges look very closely at the terms of which a question is put to them. And that is why, if there were to be the resolution of this issue through arbitration or dispute resolution panels, then we would need to be certain that the basis on which they operated and the judgments that they were going to make were appropriately fair and serious.
Now, appropriately fair in theory suggests that you want to know what the outcome's going to be before you agree to an arbitration mechanism.
No,
Have I got
quite.
that?
Pardon? No, not quite. In essence, if an arbitral panel is being asked to judge whether there is for the sake of argument, a potential or possible impact, that's very different from an arbitration panel being asked to decide if there is a real, material and significant impact.
Right, the difference between potential and actual. Well, that concludes the session. I think we have kept within the hour that you set. I hope that the compensatory mechanism will be your willingness once again to appear before us once we know what is in any deal, if one is concluded. And could you pass on from the committee our best wishes to David Frost and his negotiating team, because they've been working extremely hard, and speaking for myself, I hope very much that they are successful. That concludes the session. Order, order. Right, I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Portcullis House, the Boothroyd Room. 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 Portcullis House, the Boothroyd Room.
very grateful. I would be grateful, as we only allow this afternoon, if all answers and questions could be kept brief. And ready for the benefit of those watching, I thought I'd just explain how we will set about it, in that I will call each member who's going to ask a question in turn, and then they'll have 4 minutes to put their questions to you, Chancellor, and then I will call the next member. We've got 13 members who are going to be called in what we call ordinary time. And then we have a number of members who weren't able to have questions, who will be in extra time afterwards. And we still hope to finish on the hour. And just before I begin, I did want to say one thing which the committee was keen that I said at the start, to do with scrutiny. Scrutiny, of course, is a very important part of our role as a committee, at both sessions such as this and scrutiny of documents as well. And in fact, the Lords has made its dispositions for next year, and we're going to have a whole committee just for the Northern Ireland Protocol. I didn't know whether you knew that. And so I think it is going to come up later in the questioning, but it is very important indeed that we get in place the scrutiny arrangements for that as soon as possible and by year end, because after 40 years of really an excellent relationship between Parliament and government on this document-based scrutiny, we would like that to continue. But as I said, that will come up later. And I'd like to go straight into my questions really and ask you, what is the real deadline in your view for the completion of negotiations?
Well, thank you very much, Lord Cannul, and I welcome the new arrangements to scrutinise the Northern Ireland Protocol. The Joint Committee met today to ensure that the agreement in principle was concluded satisfactorily on both sides, and I'll make sure that the documentation relating to the protocol is made available to your committee and to others as quickly as possible. I think that when we think about the real deadline, I hope that we can conclude an agreement as quickly as possible, but the talks may go on until after Christmas. The European Parliament's made clear earlier today that if we can't conclude an agreement by Sunday, that they feel that they won't be able to ratify it appropriately. But of course, the EU can apply a provisional application of the treaty. As I mentioned to the House of Commons, near equivalent to this committee earlier today, we will want to ensure that Parliament has a say and a chance to scrutinise any agreement that's reached. So realistically, it's in the days just immediately after Christmas.
Thank you very much for that. If an agreement is reached, I wonder if you could give us a bit more colour as to the process and timetable for the ratification and implementation by the UK. And in particular, whether you could give more colour to what arrangements will be in place to ensure proper parliamentary scrutiny.
I think that we will want to ensure with Parliament's authorities that Parliament can sit for as long as possible on any of the days until about, say, even including December the 31st, so that there can be adequate scrutiny of the future relations bill. It has been the case, we know that when there has been legislation which it would suit everyone to pass as rapidly as possible, the Parliament has sat, and indeed the Lords in particular, has sat for well beyond its usual number of hours. And that is something that I would want to do, because I'd want to ensure there was the maximum amount of time for scrutiny of the legislation.
Thank you very much. You mentioned provisional application. So is it the case then that you feel that an agreement is likely to have to use provisional application as a mechanism for preventing a sort of nasty interim period?
I think it's certainly the case that the EU may need to avail themselves of that procedure. Obviously, it is a decision for them, but I think agreement at the Council on provisional application may well be an option that's exercised if we don't manage to secure agreement by Sunday.
I probably wasn't quite clear, but is there provisional application likely to be how we seek to try and do it, given that we've got quite a lot of our own procedures that may take some time to put through?
My aim would be, our aim, the government's aim would be to have a bill going before Parliament to be agreed in both houses.
Well, that's very clear, and thank you very much. And I might come back later on, but in the meantime, could I hand over, please, to Lord Kerr?
Good afternoon, Mr. Gove. You were telling our colleagues in the Commons earlier today that you thought there was a less than 50-50 chance of a deal. My hunch is there will be a deal, but supposing there isn't, you also seem to be rejecting the idea of any stopgap solutions to prevent a hiatus. You told the Commons that there would be no gap. Either there would be an agreement this month, or if there's no time for that, we must accept that there won't be an agreement. So you don't envisage negotiations in January?
No.
You said there would still be contact between the UK and the EU, but we would not be seeking to negotiate a deal. Is that seriously the government's position?
Yes, if we can't secure a free trade agreement before December the 31st, then it will be the case that we will trade with the EU on WTO terms. Of course, it's the case that there will be, as there would be between any set of neighbours, conversations, and those conversations may well involve the EU choosing or are choosing to make unilateral decisions that will make life easier for one or the other side. And it may well be that those unilateral decisions are reciprocated. People have talked about them as side deals. I don't think that's the right terminology, but I'm sure the committee will understand what I mean. But it certainly won't be the case that we will be going back in to seek to secure an FTA. If it is the case that we can't secure agreement by December the 31st, that's it.
Forgive me, is that really sustainable? Supposing Dover is a lorry park, supposing prices are shooting up in the shops, supposing manufacturers are hard hit by the EU tariffs, would we really be on our high horse riding off into the sunset, particularly if the Commission kept open the offer that Barnier has been making of the possibility of continuing negotiations in a short period of no deal?
It would be the case that we would not go back into the negotiating room to seek to secure an FTA if we couldn't agree one by December the 31st.
Why is that, Chancellor?
Because I think it's important not to, 4.5 years on from the referendum result, spin out this process unduly. I think that both sides are going the extra mile, but there has to be a deadline. Having been a newspaper executive in the past, I know that you can always extend that deadline sometimes for talented and creative writing, but there comes a point when you do have to press the button and the presses must roll.
Yes, of course, the virus intervened. It does seem, looking back, rather a pity that we turned down the idea of an extension beyond December, which we were offered back in June. You still sure that was the right thing to do?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Can we move to Baroness Donaghy, please?
Good afternoon, Chancellor. I want to ask you about the principles around the negotiations on the level playing field. I imagine you won't be in a position to go into detail on the sensitive negotiations, but could you share the principles the government's pursuing on what's variously called non-regression clauses, or I've heard recently a rebalancing mechanism? Are you able to say anything about those approaches?
Absolutely. We're committed to the principle of non-regression, and indeed the EU, in some of the trade agreements that it's secured, including, for example, with Canada, understands that, and it's a common principle in FTAs. What we take exception to was the proposition that was put forward in the negotiations that if the EU unilaterally chose to adopt new laws, and we declined to after the conclusion of our free trade agreement, that the EU could unilaterally impose tariffs or other barriers to trade if we did not follow suit. That it would be impossible for us to accept that we would face a situation where, in effect, force majeure was being applied in that way. We would want to have certainty and reciprocity in the way in which these arrangements operate. But I should also stress, as I've stressed, I think, to this committee before, we are committed, as Baroness Brown and others will know, thanks to the work of the Climate Change Committee and others, to the very highest environmental and climate change standards, and there won't be any movement away from that.
Thank you. Well, while we're on that subject, would you be seeking an obligation on the EU to take account of higher UK regulatory standards, for instance, on environmental policy, as well as an obligation upon the UK in the event of higher EU standards? Would there be that sort of flexibility?
Well, our approach is that we will set standards which we believe are high, right, and appropriate for this country. If the EU wishes to emulate them, wonderful. But it's not our desire to seek to compel by any means the EU to follow suit in any of these areas. We respect its sovereignty, and we hope it will respect ours.
Thank you. I just want to turn briefly to the issue of Gibraltar and the other overseas territories and crown dependencies. What are the implications for them if they're not included in any agreement, or if no agreement is reached? We had a statement from the Chief Minister of Gibraltar recently that they had clear assurances in 2017 from David Davis, then Secretary of State for exiting the EU, that if Spain insisted that Gibraltar would not form part of any future arrangements with the EU, then the UK will not do the deal. Does that commitment still stand?
It is the case that we're negotiating hard in order to secure Gibraltar's interest and the interest, forgive me, of all overseas territories and crown dependencies. But I can't see more at this stage about both the negotiations and also our contingency arrangements with respect to the OTs and to Gibraltar in particular.
Would those contingencies include, for instance, the similar system of an arbitration panel to determine whether there has been unacceptable variation in standards?
I think it could be the case that an arbitration panel could play a role in making sure that the free trade agreement works in the interests of all. But again, it depends on not so much the composition, but the remit of the arbitration panel. I touched on this very briefly earlier with the Commons. If an arbitration panel is asked to agree that it is legitimate for one side to retaliate if there is only a potential impact as a result of certain changes, that is one thing. If it's asked to weigh whether or not there is a material or a significant impact, that is another. I'm not using those words because those are the words which are currently in play in the negotiations. I'm simply using them to illustrate the point that an arbitration panel, like any judicial body, can only be asked to adjudicate on the basis of a particular agreement, on the basis of a particular legal text, and that arbitration panel, like all judges, will look at what the politicians have agreed and not interpolate its own view.
Thank you very much indeed. And could we move to Baroness Primarolo, please?
Good afternoon, Chancellor. Could we move to data adequacy, please? Could you explain to us what is the government doing to address concerns raised in the European Parliament and elsewhere about the granting of data adequacy to the United Kingdom? I'm thinking particularly here, for example, of the Irish Council of Civil Liberties, who has written to the Commission in connection with the largest data breach ever reported to our Information Commissioner on the real-time bidding.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that we are fully compliant with GDPR, and indeed the role that the Information Commissioner's Office plays is vital in that, in making sure that data protection rules are adhered to. Our judgment would be that, given that we are fully compliant with what EU law is at the moment, the data adequacy should be granted, therefore. But of course, it's an autonomous process that the EU undertakes to make that judgment, separate from the FTA. I'm more hopeful in the course of developments in the last few days that adequacy will be granted. If it's not, then obviously businesses can insulate themselves from any of the risks through the additional standard contractual clauses to the relationship that they have with EU commercial actors.
But Chancellor, for UK businesses, particularly data economy, they're used to being not in an environment where there's any regulatory obstacles. And the implications of not getting data adequacy are very substantial. You talk about using contractual arrangements, but you are aware, I'm sure, of the report that's been done by the New Economics Foundation on the costs of not having data adequacy to business, which it estimates to be between 1 billion and 1.6 billion compliance costs that they won't be able to spend on their businesses. So what steps will the government take to mitigate this if there's not a data adequacy agreement in place by the 1st of January?
There is extensive information on the ICO's own website, which can help business to prepare. And it's certainly the case that the Secretary of State for DCMS has been energetic in making sure that business understands the ways in which it can prepare in the event that we don't secure adequacy. But as I say, I'm more confident, though I can't be 100%, that because of recent developments that is more likely.
So your response, just to be sure I'm understanding you clearly here, Chancellor, is you anticipate that we will get data adequacy going forward, but if we don't, then businesses will have to take the mitigating steps in order to protect themselves and spend the extra money to do so. Is that correct?
Yes, but I think that the argument about the amount is one that, or the question of the amount is one that can legitimately be debated, but it's certainly the case that if businesses do undertake the mitigation measures that I've mentioned, that they won't face those risks. I should also say that it will be the case that for EU businesses as well, there will be appropriate steps that they might wish to undertake as well.
Indeed. Perhaps then I could move on to the question which is linked to data adequacy and us getting the data adequacy agreement, which is with regard to the UK taking steps to mitigate the gaps that will occur between the UK-EU security cooperation. And I wondered whether you would be in a position to tell us what steps are being taken in the event of a deal or no deal with regard to access to these databases.
I think it should be the case in the event of the comprehensive agreement that we seek, that we will have access to all of the law enforcement and national security and justice tools that we want, with perhaps one particular exception. But it's also the case that if we don't secure that agreement, then it will be the case that there are alternative steps that we can take and alternative measures that we can use, many of which we were using in the first half of the first decade of the century.
Well, given, Chancellor, that you said you thought there was only a 50-50 chance of agreement, and given that the Home Office Minister was unable to tell the House of Commons Home Affairs Select Committee or the officials who accompanied him to exactly explain what the suitable arrangements would be for alternative databases to be in place, perhaps you could give us a little more detail now, and with regard specifically, for example, to SIS2.
Yes, the Schengen Information System 2, which again is a database to which we've only had access since the second half of the first decade of the century. It would be the database that would be most difficult for us to secure access to, because it would require us to accept ECJ jurisdiction. But it is the case that information can be shared through Interpol and other means. And it's also the case that when it comes to the key national security questions, which should be at the forefront of any minister's mind, we know that national security is a national state competence, and the forms of cooperation that already exist, for example, between security agencies and others, are robust, are well tested and well understood. It's also the case, and I say this in no boastful way because it reflects well on others and not on me, that EU countries benefit significantly from the cooperation that they have with UK law enforcement and national security agencies, and I think it's in everyone's interest that pragmatic cooperation should continue.
Yes, but if there's not a deal, there won't be.
Sorry, Baroness Brumarodo, I regret awfully much that we, in the interest of time, will have to move on, but we may be able to come back to that in extra time, and I'll add you to the list for that. We come therefore to Lord Wood.
Yes, hello, Mr. Gove. Very good of you to join us today. I want to ask you about traffic and transportation issues. Could you outline what major disruption businesses and citizens should expect to experience in the weeks after the 1st of January, either with or without an agreement?
Well, we've published a reasonable worst case scenario in the event of no agreement that lays out what we think is at the pessimistic end of what could be expected. Again, it's difficult to predict accurately because, as everyone will appreciate, passenger and freight traffic has been affected by the COVID pandemic. It's also the case that the level of business readiness has been improving over the course of the last few months. So I think the reasonable worst case scenario is at the pessimistic end, but obviously it provides us with a scenario against which we can plan.
You gave some details to the Commons earlier on about that reasonable worst case scenario. I believe you said that 40 to 70% of HGVs heading for the EU won't be ready for new controls, creating queues of up to 7,000 trucks and delays lasting 2 days as a reasonable worst case scenario. Is that correct? And if so, I think people will be wondering why, after all this time for preparation, that is the scenario we expect in just 15 days.
Again, let me draw a distinction. The reasonable worst case scenario is not the prediction of what we expect. It is a planning scenario. Contingency in government requires the officials with whom we work and the ministers responsible for these decisions to work out what could, in the worst eventuality, to a reasonable person occur, so that we can plan for that, so that we're not blithe or blasé. But our expectation would be that the situation would not be that bad because of the scale and level of preparation that business leaders have put in place.
Can I ask you about the Kent access permit? One of the issues that keeps coming up is how the authorities are going to distinguish between trucks heading for the EU coming through Kent, needing a Kent access permit, and those heading for domestic destinations inside Kent, like Ashford, Dover, or Folkestone, who do not. How will the monitoring system be able to distinguish those two categories of transport?
I will defer on this occasion to my colleague Emma Churchill, the Director General in charge of the Board and Protocol Delivery Group. Emma.
Yes, thank you very much. So, as you correctly say, it is only a requirement to have a Kent access permit if you are making the international trip out of Kent over the short straits. So there are two different categories of HGV that would be perfectly properly driving around the Kent strategic network without wanting to make that crossing. One is hauliers who are locally based, and they will be working with Kent County Council, will be issuing them with local access permits, which they will have and will entitle them to drive on that network. There's also, of course, the case that there will be some who are not haulage firms who are based in Kent and therefore will have those local access permits. But they will have, as they come through down the M2 or the M20, they will, of course, be entitled to be doing that without a Kent access permit. Now, the DVSA enforcement people who will be enforcing the Kent access permit, of course, are able to tell, firstly, those who do not have an international operator's license. So they will know for those who are not likely to be making the international trip and will know not to take enforcement action against them. Secondly, we are recommending that those who are doing domestic distribution in that way carry proof with them that they are doing so. So if they were pulled over, that they would be able to demonstrate that they did not need a Kent access permit.
Thank you. Thank you. And if I have time, lastly, I want to ask you about the issue that, again, has come up often in our hearings, which is the welfare and safety questions around the inadequacy of facilities for lorry drivers who may be spending a lot of time stationary in Kent. How are you responding to those concerns?
We've worked with the Kent Resilience Forum and Kent County Council in order to provide appropriate facilities. And as you quite rightly pointed out, it's all the more important that they are there because of the pandemic risk. But again, Emma may say more.
Yes, absolutely. Our colleagues in Department for Transport have been working very closely with Kent Resilience Forum, and they have a full welfare plan for drivers. Of course, that covers a number of things. Firstly, of course, it covers medical provision that will need to be on site both at Sevington and at Manston. It also covers other types of welfare provision. I know that Kent Resilience Forum, forgive me, have spent a lot of time thinking about the toiletry provisions for drivers, which of course is very important both at Sevington and at Manston. I should also say that they have worked very closely with Kent Resilience Forum and other local health leaders to make sure that all the sites are COVID secure and are properly COVID secure is the way that you would expect.
Thank you very much indeed. Could we move please to Baroness Brown?
Thank you, Lord Chairman, and good afternoon, Chancellor. I'm going to continue on the same topic. So I'm going to, can you tell us when port and inland customs facilities and IT systems will be ready for the new arrangements? And indeed, by that time, will they have been thoroughly trialled so we can be sure they will work smoothly?
Yes, it is the case that all our inland facilities are ready. There are one or two areas, like, for example, the development of HMRC facilities in Ashford-Sevington, which won't be fully ready, but this is only part of the Sevington site until after the new year. As far as databases go, they are being extensively piloted and tested and indeed used, and the database or portal to which Stuart just referred, the check and HGV is ready for the border system, was up and running on Monday and has been well used since then.
Yes, it has. So yes, all the systems that now need to be live for January are live. That includes the goods vehicle movement service that I know this committee has been concerned about. That has opened for registrations. That is being used now by haulage firms, and Check and HGV is ready to cross the border. The other web service I know the committee has been interested in, which is the one you use to get your Kent Access permit, went live on Monday, and indeed is already being used. I believe over 360 Kent Access permits have already been issued for the 1st of January and beyond. So those systems are up and running. Just on the infrastructure that you asked about, it is the case that Ashford-Sevington is going to be ready on the 1st of January for the purposes of traffic management. It has been agreed that the HMRC functions, which might have been done on that site, will instead, for the month of January, be done on Ashford Waterbrook, which, as you may know, is right next to Sevington, and that was the contingency that we had in place for if Sevington was not ready to open for all of those functions. All the other inland sites that need to be ready for the 1st of January are going to be ready to open as planned.
And all these new IT systems that have gone live, have there been any problems since they've gone live?
No. None that I've heard of, but I'm sure that if there are problems, we will hear of them, and I hope the committee will as well, so that we can tackle them.
Thank you. And can I ask you about the Port Infrastructure Fund? Is it adequate? We're hearing reports that it's been hugely oversubscribed, and for example, that Dover has been allocated £33,000 against a bid for £33 million. So are we going to have adequate infrastructure available next year?
It was heavily subscribed. It is the case that we've been able to give the overwhelming majority of ports that applied support. In the specific case of Dover, their bid encompassed some entirely understandable requests for support to put infrastructure in place, which would not have been in place, which could not be in place until 2023. The purpose of the Port Infrastructure Fund was to ensure that the infrastructure that's required by July is in place, but we're continuing to work with Dover in order to make sure that their perfectly legitimate request to improve facilities overall in the coming years can be met.
Thank you. And can I very quickly follow up on Baroness Donaghy's question? If we were, for example, to have very much higher standards, for example, in the area of CO2 emissions, I think I understood you to say we wouldn't want to be able to take any action against the EU if they were working to lower standards. So do you mean by that that if our industries are experiencing extra costs for decarbonising that their competitors in the EU are not experiencing, that we wouldn't want to do anything to support our industries in that situation?
Well, we will do everything we can to support industries in the absolutely vital drive to decarbonise, But one of the things that we don't intend to do is to penalise our friends in Europe if they don't maintain the same high standards as us.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, we come to Lord Sharkey.
Yes, thank you, Charles. A week ago, Chancellor, the Commission brought forward 4 contingency measures to mitigate some of the significant disruptions that would occur on January the 1st in case the deal with the UK is not yet in place. When will the government bring forward no-deal contingency measures to reciprocate the ones published by the Commission on basic road and air connectivity, aviation safety and fisheries?
Very shortly. We are warm and positive to the proposals that have been put forward on aviation safety, air transport and road transport. We have more reservations about the Commission's approach on fisheries, but we do recognise that these unilateral steps by the Commission can benefit both sides.
You probably have seen that the latest market with an eye, Purchasing Managers Index, says that shortage of critical inputs alongside pressure on capacity following forward purchasing by clients ahead of Brexit contributed to the sharpest rise in backlogs of work across the manufacturing sector since May 2010. And so what would be your response to that and to concerns about the risk of supplier or consumer stockpiling ahead of the 31st of December?
Well, I think it has been the case that the business has been making sure that it has strong stocks in those areas that can be appropriately warehoused. So whether it's supermarkets with ambient goods or whether it's manufacturers making sure that they have access to parts, and that is an entirely understandable step that they should take. I should say that even absent the end of the transition period in other parts of the world, other economic actors have done similar things because of the well-advertised and well-understood pressures on global trade that COVID has generated, and that also have been affecting the containerized sector. So those steps have been taken, but of course it's our aim to ensure, as we discussed earlier, that we can maintain the freest flowing trade possible, hence the steps that we've taken on infrastructure and databases.
Can I come back briefly to the contingency measures that we talked about a moment ago? I mean, how sustainable in the long term are these measures if there's no agreed basis for the future UK-EU trading and security relationship?
Well, again, the EU has made it clear that these are unilateral moves, which, as I say, we will be announcing how we might reciprocate. And again, should it be the case that we don't secure a free trade agreement, then there will be, I think everyone understands, a period of adjustment. The disruption in the reasonable worst case scenario is envisaged to diminish over time, and whether or not that scenario is unduly pessimistic, I think most people would agree that we would find during that period of adjustment a new normal demonstrating itself.
But these contingency measures have to mirror each other, ours with the EU, if they're going to be effective.
On aviation and road transport, pretty much yes. On fisheries, again, that remains a subject of contention.
Does that mean no?
On fisheries?
Yes.
Well, the specific ask on fisheries is one that we think is, how can I put this, a bit forward. So, but I won't say more at this stage because the Environment Secretary will be saying more about it.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed. And could we move on, please, to Baroness Neville-Rolfe?
Chancellor, congratulations on the progress you've made latterly in the joint committee. I believe that the text of the draft decisions and the unilateral statements on the operation of the protocol were agreed today. And I was just wondering, were any amendments made and how long will the arrangements last?
No amendments were made. Obviously, the Joint Committee itself is a confidential process, but I think it's fair to say that it was cordial, no changes were made. There's going to be a refinement on the EU side on the list of arbitrators that it's put forward, but I think that's a substitution of one distinguished figure for another.
Thank you. And how will the operation compare in the event of sort of one agreement and two non-agreement? on the future relationship?
Well, the Northern Ireland Protocol is designed to be an all-weather arrangement, and it was explicitly, of course, designed to ensure that in the absence of a free trade agreement, that both the EU single market could be protected, but also Northern Ireland's integral place in our customs territory could be protected as well. That is what it does. Obviously, a free trade agreement, if it can be successfully concluded, means that some aspects of the protocol become easier to manage.
Yeah, and on that, I mean, are you working with business on how the trading will actually work and to test the mechanisms? I was thinking that, as an ex-retailer, that a dummy run attempted by lorries sort of serving perhaps small businesses across both borders and back to test the paperwork and the IT systems and the VAT and the health certificates and rules of origin and so on would make a lot of sense. And I wondered how much of that has been attempted or will be attempted now you've agreed the arrangements.
Well, world-class supermarkets like Tesco have been working closely with us, and Brendan Threlfall, who is the mastermind behind this agreement, may say more.
Thanks, CDL. Yeah, so there have been, just on the testing, there have been already some of the Northern Ireland hauliers have tried the goods vehicle movement service, which HMRC run. So there has been some testing. I think on the specifics falling out of the joint committee, there's less on the goods at risk tariffs issue, for example. It's less a question of immediately testing, but getting businesses registered onto that scheme, which is now live on .gov.uk, and traders can register for that now. And then there's going to be a period of provisional authorization into this UK trader scheme, as we call it, a 4-month period of provisional authorization, and then you will turn into the permanently trusted authorized trader. But that's a sort of registration process, if you like, rather than testing as such. But
if you're a small business, I think it would be quite helpful if you could sort of do a test with them or for them, talking to the Northern Irish businesses as well. Not obviously just the big Tesco's, who will be well prepared, but also the very many smaller companies and indeed service industries that we worry about.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and we are, and just to reassure on the business engagement front, that is an across the board process. So it doesn't just, obviously the bigger retailers are certainly engaged, but also all the small business organisations are represented. We're particularly focused on small business readiness because we know there are challenges. There. So we're extremely alive to that.
And we've seen more than 10,000 businesses in Northern Ireland sign up for the Trader Support Service in order to ensure that their worries can be dealt with.
Yeah, and do you get the impression they're feeling a bit better about it all, because they were obviously particularly concerned and came and told the committee that?
Yes, and I wouldn't say that every single worry has been set at ease, but I do think that since the agreement in principle last week and its adoption today, there's been a widespread welcome from the overwhelming majority of Northern Ireland businesses, but we'll continue to work with those that have concerns in order to address them. Your broader point about dry runs, I should also say that we have been undertaking dry runs for a number of sectors in the event of a non-negotiated outcome to make sure that, for example, fish and shellfish can make their way rapidly to Boulogne-sur-Mer for sale. And we're learning from those dry runs.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Can we move to Baroness Cootie, please?
Apologies, I was just struggling to unmute. Good afternoon. Can I start by asking, when the long-term regime for the unfettered access for goods from Northern Ireland to the UK, when will that actually become operational? Because we haven't got much time to the 1st of January.
Well, unfettered access for goods from Northern Ireland to the UK?
For Northern Ireland businesses to the UK, yes, exactly.
Operational now.
It's operational now, so not so they won't see a particular change from that perspective.
Provided they,
sorry?
No, the Trader Support Service is there in order to ensure that all their needs are met. Right.
So how will goods moving between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, requiring or not requiring export declarations, be differentiated actually in practice on the ground?
Moving from Northern Ireland to the UK?
Between Northern Ireland and Great Britain.
Well, it will be the case that the processes that we have in place at the moment can provide sufficient information to the EU to satisfy the requirements as they see it, of the Union Customs Code. But over to Brendan.
Yes, just on the unfettered access side, there was effectively going to be two phases. So phase one for us on this definition of what is a qualifying Northern Ireland good and business will be on the basis of the statutory instrument that's gone through both houses now, which is effectively all goods in free circulation in Northern Ireland for this interim period, which is a more open approach, we acknowledge, but one designed to provide some continuity and stability in January. We are then going to transition on from that into a phase two approach to unfettered access, which we set out in the command paper, which is going to auto-enroll Northern Ireland established traders into the goods vehicle movement system effectively with HMRC to give them a reference number. And at that point, you can then use this GVMS system to ensure that we can distinguish between Northern Ireland authorised traders and a trader, for example, coming in from Ireland wanting to use a transit route into Great Britain. At that point, we would have the long-term system in place. Ideally, and our aim there is to align it with the point at which we start to phase in controls in GB more generally for EU trade. So, for example, on the Dublin to Holyhead route.
Right. So if we're looking at export declarations, actually on the ground, how will you be able to tell between those businesses requiring export declarations and those not?
Again, I think
how does it work?
Well, as Brendan said, it's stage one permissive, stage two, Northern Ireland businesses themselves registering to avail themselves of this freedom.
I think it should say, and just to add in phase one, there is
so it's just a registration. So when they go through, they're picked up on a system.
Yes, that will work from next summer. There'll be everyone will be on the goods vehicle movement system, and that will allow you to differentiate. From the 1st of January, there is still through the taxation bill an anti-avoidance measure so that HMRC can take action if they pick up, and there are already through intelligence, whether it's intelligence or shipping manifests, data that we have on these movements that could pick up someone trying to divert deliberately through Northern Ireland. But that will be that's an interim operational response. From next summer, we'll move the system onto a longer term footing.
Great.
Another mistake, I'm sorry. Thank you, Baroness. Could we move to Lord Faulkner, please?
Good afternoon, Chancellor. Thank you for coming to see us again. Staying with the trader scheme, could I ask you what proportion of traders and indeed trade operating between Great Britain and Northern Ireland will be covered by it? Have you any estimate of that?
The overwhelming majority.
And in that case, their goods will thereby be judged not to be at risk of moving into the EU single market. Is that right?
Yes.
And are you relying on them to self-certify that, or will there be checks to see that what they're saying is correct?
We will make sure that it's Northern Ireland qualifying businesses who do avail themselves of that opportunity. And again, as Brendan indicated, there are ways of making sure that if people are trying to play fast and loose with the system, that we can be alert to that.
Thank you. And they will cover SMEs, will it, as well as larger companies?
Yes.
And can you give us a sense of what goods or traders are unlikely to be covered?
I think major multinational concerns that are likely to be sourcing a variety of products and then into Northern Ireland, and then sending high-spec finished goods from Northern Ireland out.
And in those cases, when will the tariff waivers and reimbursement scheme for such goods come into operation?
Well, it will be the case that we will reimburse and waive all tariffs, but Brendan may say a little bit more about that process.
Yes, so the tariff waiver scheme will be available from day one, but it's important to say that will only go up to certain ceilings on how much you can claim over a period of time. So if you're a big Processo brings things into Northern Ireland to then send them onto the European Union, you're unlikely to be covered for that. But if you're a smaller business, you will be covered by the tariff waiver scheme. And then the reimbursement scheme is something that HMRC are going to roll out early next year, and so we need to provide further guidance on that.
And you're confident HMRC will be ready, are you?
Pretty confident, yes. One of the things about the last year is I've been impressed by the speed with which HMRC has responded, not just to the COVID pandemic and the responsibilities placed on it, but to the various requests that we have made of them. And
the last area I'd like you to talk me through is how the scheme will work in practice for goods that start in Great Britain, leave Great Britain at the port of Holyhead, go to Dunleary, and then the trucks are driven north to Northern Ireland. How's it going to cover them? Well, we should have a twin track approach, which means that we can distinguish between goods that are destined for Northern Ireland or come from Northern Ireland and goods that are destined for the Irish Republic or come from the Irish Republic.
Yeah, just to add on to that, CDL, the decision of the Joint Committee refers to goods being moved by direct transport between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And the legal definition of direct transport can include transiting through another territory. So in this case, that would be through Ireland and the EU's customs territory, providing the goods stay under customs supervision. So in practice, that will mean you can use the Holyhead to Dublin route and avail yourself of this UK trader scheme. You will just have to put your goods into the transit procedure, which means sealing the truck and going to a point of destination in Northern Ireland and releasing your goods for free circulation at that point. So that they can't go missing in Ireland, if you like.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. So I wouldn't be able to have, in my big truck, I wouldn't be able to have half of my goods aiming for, say, the Dublin market and the other half for the Belfast market.
No, they couldn't fall off the back of the lorry and into free circulation in Ireland, no.
No, I didn't suggest falling off the back of a lorry. I was thinking about being delivered to customers in both cities.
No.
But that's not possible because it's effectively going to be sealed as it goes.
Yes.
From one port to the other city. Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you
very much. We come to Lord Lamont.
Good afternoon, Chancellor. Very good indeed of you to come in the present very busy period. Could I turn to the end of the grace periods for authorised traders' supply of chilled meats and animal products? Is it not the case that after the grace period, all animal and plant products entering Northern Ireland from Britain will require export health certificates, which will cost £200 each? And after the expiry of the grace period for chilled meat, Northern Ireland will have to source fresh meat products locally or from the Republic unless the exemption is extended to all UK-EU trade by agreement with Brussels.
With respect to the first grace period on export health certificates, the period that was agreed following our own consultation with the supermarket and the agri-food sector here, so that they felt that they were in a position to be effectively compliant with the EHC requirements. And I think the costs may be cumulatively less than you mentioned. With respect to the chilled meat exemption, it is the case that it exists for 6 months, but it's explicitly also the case that an attempt by some to argue that this should be non-renewable was rejected, because we want to make sure that we are in a position in order to ensure that Northern Ireland suppliers can, if necessary, get the products that they need for their customers in Northern Ireland.
I did note quite a cautious reaction from business groups in Northern Ireland, and some saying that you have fundamentally altered the relationship between Northern Ireland and Britain, because what you've done is take measures that will avert empty stores and empty shelves in the short term, but you fundamentally increase the costs, and it will mean that Northern Ireland will either have to supply itself locally or increasingly from the south because of the cost structure.
Well, I'd say two things. I think the first thing is that inherent in the protocol right from the very beginning when it was signed was an acceptance that the EU acquis would apply in certain areas. The negotiations that we undertook with Maros Šefčovič were designed to reduce, mitigate, or manage that process. The second thing is that, of course, there are significant and important exceptions to this rule, but a large part of the produce in particular that's provided, say, pork products and so on, to consumers in Northern Ireland originates in Northern Ireland. And I think it is the case that there are Northern Ireland producers who see an opportunity here as well. And I think it would be, obviously it's a decision, commercial decision for the actors concerned, but no bad thing for Northern Ireland's food sector to continue to be able to provide Northern Ireland consumers with high quality products.
Could I just, you mentioned the phrase, first time it's been mentioned, acquis there. If I could just go back to Baroness Donaghy's question about the level playing field, one can understand why environmental issues, social issues become the source of an argument about competitiveness, and why the British government has accepted the principle of non-regression applying to these areas. But where, in relation to the acquis, does the non-regression principle end? I mean, the acquis is not just environmental measures, it's not just social measures. There is a whole corpus of tens of thousands of laws. Presumably, the non-regression principle is not going to apply to the generality of the acquis, and we will be able to alter it subject to certain boundaries.
That is exactly what we're aiming to do through the negotiations, yes.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Could we move to Lord Thomas, please?
Chancellor, it's very good of you to come. May I ask you two questions? The first, a more general one about parliamentary scrutiny here in Westminster and also in Northern Ireland, as to the way in which the protocol will be operating and any changes that will be made. How do you see that working?
Well, I think it's important, obviously, that UK government ministers make themselves available to the Northern Ireland Assembly so that we can answer questions and be held to account for the decisions that we've made. I think it's also a very welcome development that your Lordship's House will have a select committee specifically to look at the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. It will be the case that I'll be meeting in the new year, if I'm still in post, with the Commission Vice President Maroš Šefčovič on a regular basis, and I will always seek to update Parliament after those meetings. I think that the operation of the protocol will matter hugely for reasons that the committee well knows, to the 1.5 million people in Northern Ireland, and we would want to be in a position where they could have confidence, as well as other UK citizens and indeed EU member states, that it was operating effectively.
Now, over the next few weeks, it's obviously important there should be no lacuna in the way in which scrutiny is carried out. How do you think you can facilitate that?
Well, speaking personally and for myself, every day that Parliament may sit in order to bring forward the Future Relationship Bill, I will be here. And should it be the case that this committee or any other feels that it's appropriate, either after the conclusion of an FTA or in the absence of an FTA, to invite me to answer questions, then I, or if in extremis I'm unavailable, another minister will make themselves available. I think it's absolutely vital that we provide people with all the information they need so that a democratic judgment can be made.
And so you envisage no lacuna in the scrutiny process over the next couple of months?
No, and I'd say two things. The first thing is, in the very near term, Parliament can sit on any day apart from Christmas Day, if necessary, but also in the short to medium term. Obviously, it's a matter for the House, or both Houses, which committees they decide to set up in order to scrutinise the government. But even if I can't always answer questions for as long as we might both want, I will always do everything I can to make myself available, as will other ministers.
And then will the government continue to provide from the 1st of January explanatory memorandum on EU acts within the scope of the protocol?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we come to our last question, and there are 4 colleagues who have asked whether they might be able to ask something, as it were, in injury time, which would take us, if you agreed to it, to releasing you at 5 to 6 or so. And I wondered whether you might be prepared to take their questions as well.
Of course.
That's very generous of you, and I appreciate that. So our last regular time question comes from Baroness Hamwi.
Thank you, and good evening, Chancellor. I hope no injuries are involved, actually. Can I ask about citizens' rights? Firstly, the situation in EU states. Are you happy that they're going to get everything lined up in time to be able to process applications from EU nationals, in particular France, where they've given themselves a very short window to deal with this?
Yes, and to his enormous credit, Vice President Maros Šefčovič has been very diligent in making sure that EU member states live up to their obligations.
Are you in touch with representative groups in the different countries? There are some very active ones.
I have been, but particularly it has been the case that the FCDO and my colleague, the Paymaster General Penny Mordaunt, who leads on citizens' rights, as well, of course, as the Home Office, have been energetic in talking to those groups, yes.
Right, thank you. Well, my other question, and I'll be quick to let the others come in. You may say this is entirely with the Home Office, but I saw that Mr. Šefčovič referred to reassurances about the settled status scheme. There is a concern here about the individuals who've not applied and who are very hard to reach. Have you been able to discuss means of communications with him to give the reassurances?
Again, Vice President Šefčovič has been very energetic in making sure that the rights of EU citizens in the UK are protected. And it is the case, of course, that the EU settlement scheme will run up right until halfway through next year. We'll do everything possible to contact everyone concerned. It was estimated at the time of the referendum that there were some 3 million EU citizens living in the UK, but it's now been the case that 4 million applications have been processed. And I have to say that I'm delighted both that the Home Office have managed to proceed at speed, but also delighted that 4 million EU citizens want to stay and make their future in the UK. I think more than 700,000 people from Poland, who are Polish citizens, will be staying here. And I think there are more than 50,000 Slovaks and more than 200,000 Italians. That's great news.
Yep, and I think it must be 4.5 million applications by now, because it was almost that by the end of last month. Can I just ask you, because I know you've got you're very pragmatic, lots of imagination, to impress on colleagues that if the communications to find the people who've not applied haven't worked so far, we don't want more of the same, we want something different, as I say, imaginative. So that's a personal request.
It's a very good and fair point, and we will do everything we can, absolutely, to reach everyone affected.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, we come to the injury time questions, and there are 5 colleagues who wanted to ask short questions. The first was Lord Teverson, then Lord Cavendish, then Lord Oates, Baroness Verma, and then Baroness Primarolo. And so could I ask Lord Teverson, please, to ask his question?
Yes, good evening, Chancellor. Yesterday, my own subcommittee met with the agri-food sector looking at exports. And one of the key questions that they had was around third country listing and where that was. Perhaps you could just let us know what the situation is on that is at the moment, and perhaps explain if that isn't granted, presumably under a situation of no deal, what that actually means.
Well, my understanding is that we should have third country listing, but Jess, my colleague, will provide us with the latest up-to-date picture.
Thank you, CDL. So third country listing comes in the category of decisions that the EU makes unilaterally, rather than subject to the negotiations. There are various categories of third country. There are various different lists onto which a third country can be placed. My understanding, although I should seek to confirm this afterwards because I'm afraid I don't have the detail on top of my head, is that we have been granted listing on a particular list, but I can't now remember, I'm afraid, which one that is. So I will have to supply that information afterwards, and I apologise.
Because I think there are distinctions when it comes to agri-food and also, as it happens, pet travel and so on. But I think we do have third country listing on agri-food on the basis that we remain compliant with, in the event of a non-negotiated item, on the basis that we remain compliant with EU SPS requirements for a particular period. I'm pretty certain that's the case. If it's not the case, then I'll get instantly onto the committee afterwards to clarify.
I think it's pretty fundamental, actually, Chancellor. So I think everybody would appreciate that. And just as a final comment, I was a bit disappointed that on the data side, you said that Schengen Information System 2 was the one that was unlikely to be there. I mean, that one, I think that's a bit of a celebration for villains, to be honest, because I know all the other channels that there are, but that one is far, far, far more efficient than any other. But I just leave that as a comment.
I completely understand, and of course, it was the case that we opted into Schengen Information System 2 during the coalition years, and I don't deny that there are authoritative figures who do pay testament to its advantages, but there are alternatives, and it's also the case that there are other things that we can do outside the EU to improve our security. But I very much take your point in the spirit in which it was offered.
Thank you very much indeed. And so for the last time, I call Lord Cavendish, who is shortly to retire from our committee, and we will wish him well. Lord Cavendish.
Thank you very much, Lord Chairman. Good evening, Chancellor. You fielded a lot of highly technical questions, for which many thanks. Mine's rather different, and I'm also going to ask for you to use your imagination. Would you agree that relations with our EU friends have been really rather bruised by the Brexit process? And looking ahead, may I ask whether any thought has been given to devising a post-Brexit political process aimed at achieving what one might describe as the equivalent of a 21st century entente cordiale?
I think it's a very good question, and yes, I said in a different context that I believe that what we should seek to have is a special relationship with the European Union and with its member states. And as everyone appreciates, we have very good bilateral relations with all of the EU 27, whether that's cooperation with France on defence and security, as we're currently exhibiting with UK forces in Mali, or whether it's cooperation on life sciences with Germany and the Netherlands. But overall, you're right, the process of resetting this relationship will have had its ups and downs, but the broader point that we recognise and respect both the sovereignty of the EU and also the ambitions of its peoples should be at the heart of a new relationship, which I hope will follow on from the conclusion of an FTA if we can secure it.
Thank you, Lord Chancellor, and Lord Chairman. I wish you all well. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Lord Cavendish. Lord Oates.
Good evening, Mr. Gove, and thanks for spending time with us at this busy time. In response to the Lord Chairman, you said that even if an agreement was arrived at after Sunday, the government would still wish to push a bill through Parliament before December the 31st, rather than provisionally apply the agreement as the EU intends. Is that correct at whatever point before the 31st of December such an agreement was concluded?
We will do everything possible to make sure that we can bring a bill forward, and we will certainly ensure that we involve Parliament in our processes.
And just as a follow-up, my understanding is that the government intention would be for legislation to pass through the House of Lords in less than a day. Would you regard that as an acceptable time for scrutiny of an agreement as complex as this?
The longer the better, in my view.
But do you think that would be acceptable?
I think if we're faced with the choice between concluding a free trade agreement and not, I would rather that we did so as expeditiously as possible.
But why not provisionally apply it to allow that scrutiny to happen, just as the European Parliament will have?
I'll hand over to Jess.
So, if I may, the procedures on the European side are obviously different to the procedures on our side. Our assessment is that there are steps that need to be taken in order to put the agreement into domestic legislation. There isn't a significant difference, in fact, in time between what you might call here provisional application and full implementation. So our judgment at this time is that it would not save any time to try and imagine what you might call provisional application on this side. So as CDL says, the intention is to conclude the agreement as rapidly as possible. Of course, really, we would all have rather that it had already been agreed and concluded, and that everybody had longer, not least of all us, to write the thing and introduce it and scrutinise it. That's unfortunately not the case. But we still are seeking for the agreement to be concluded as soon as possible, and the bill then to be given as much time as possible in the House, given the constraints that are now on the time of the House of Commons and the House of Lords between now and the end of the year, which will have to be a matter for the Houses to agree in terms of how much time there is to be made available.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. The penultimate question is from Baroness Verma.
Thank you, Lord Chairman, and thank you, Chancellor. Mine's a very practical question, Chancellor. If there are traffic jams building up on motorways, will there be some sort of digital alert that lorry drivers can actually log in on to make alternative arrangements, especially if they are carrying goods that may not be sustainable for long waits on a motorway? And if so, will they be introduced very early on?
Two things I'd say. Firstly, and thank you very much for the question, because it gives me an opportunity to say two things for where I can express gratitude. The first is that we will be able to expedite, if there is disruption, both shellfish and day-old chicks, the two commodities which are most perishable, and we have arrangements in place to provide for their fast tracking. And I'm grateful to everyone who's been involved in that process. But the second area of gratitude I'd like to express is that a short bill which made provision for the sharing of information through HMRC and others in order to ensure that our Border Operations Centre can provide real-time information passed through your Lordship's House earlier today and received royal assent even as this committee was meeting. And I'm very, very grateful for the fact that that bill was effectively scrutinised, but also placed on the statute book at pace.
Thank you very much indeed. So the final question is from Baroness Primarolo.
Chancellor, could I just briefly return to the question of access to databases, which the UK will be unable to have access to, SIS2, the live passenger records, DNA fingerprinting. These are a vital component to our national security, and we get this information in real time. For instance, Icarus, we get within 15 minutes. The alternatives that you referred to, falling back on various arrangements that existed before, some of those will move from being real-time information to information that could take up to 60 or more days for the police to receive the information. Given that access to this information is vital to our personal security and national security, what steps will the government take to ensure that we can still have access to the other databases? You've mentioned SIS2, but what about the other ones? What about passenger name information, for example, or DNA and fingerprinting?
Well, we do hope that we'll be able to reach an agreement on PNR access, which, as you quite rightly point out, can be a very useful tool. I think it's probably best if, in the event of a non-negotiated outcome, that I can return to the committee and explain in detail which databases we will continue to have access to and on what terms, and also what other steps that we can take in order to improve border security in other ways as a balancing item. But I do recognise that it is a balanced picture. Can I also take advantage of this opportunity before the committee to say one thing to clarify, if not to correct, a point that I made when I was appearing in front of the sister committee in the House of Commons earlier. At the beginning of that committee hearing, the chairman asked a series of quick-fire questions to which he wished to secure understandably brief answers about our participation in programmes. And as I mentioned right at the very beginning, sometimes in an anxiety to give a brief answer, one doesn't always give the best answer. I was specifically asked about Copernicus, and I couldn't guarantee that we would be part of the Copernicus programme in the same way that I can't guarantee that we would be part of Horizon, Erasmus, or Euratom. But we are looking at all of these programmes in the context of the negotiations. nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, but there are some EU programs which we would want to continue to be part of. Again, once any agreement is reached, or if no agreement is reached, then I'll be happy to come back to this committee to explain the approach that we've taken towards continued participation in particular EU programs, or we've chosen not to participate, how a domestic alternative can be put in place. And I'm sorry again for trespassing on your time, but I just wanted to emphasize that it is a necessarily fluid situation and no one should overread into any of my comments earlier a determination at this stage on our part to opt into or to opt out of any programme definitively.
Well, I'm very grateful for that. And that was one of the areas that was on the cutting room floor, I'm afraid, when we framed our question set. So that's a very helpful clarification. And can I thank you and your colleagues for the spirit in which you have answered our questions today, and indeed for being here, as we all well realize how busy you are. And boy, we all wish you well in the efforts that you're making at the moment. And please will you pass on our good wishes to our colleague, Lord Frost, who we hope to see soon as well. I'm afraid we will hope to beg another place in your diary, probably as early as January. I'm grateful for you saying that you would do everything to try and make that as well. In the meantime, happy Christmas and goodbye. And I declare the meeting closed.
Committee Room 3, sound. Committee Room 3, sound. Committee Room 3, sound.